We'll know at the top of the hour whether Donald Trump walks away from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. He's certainly in sync with a new national security advisor and a new Secretary of State, hawkish, squarely on the side of Israel and Saudi Arabia on this one. Now, we're going to be looking at Trump's options, the chances that decertifying an agreement that enforces strict inspection of Tehran's nuclear sites will escalate tensions in the region. Also, Europe's options. Over the past weeks, the French president, the German chancellor, the UK foreign secretary, all traveling to Washington to try and convince the US president to stay in it. They're not holding their breath, though, and early reports indicate that Trump is looking like he's going to walk away. Of course, it's too early to tell. Today in the France 24 debate, it is make or break time. And joining us for this edition, he's the associate editor-in-chief of French news weekly magazine Paris Match, Régis Le Sommier.
Hello.
How are you?
Good.
Also joining us, Caroline Galacteros, geopolitical analyst, CEO of Planeting. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, I'm very happy to.
From Tehran, France 24 correspondent Reza Saya is with us. And we'll see the different reactions within Iran with you, Reza, because there's more than just one type of reaction where you're standing. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Look, it was a campaign promise and an oft-repeated mantra that we've heard from the 45th president of the United States.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions I've ever seen drawn by anybody, ever. And I mean never. Frankly, it was totally one-sided. It should have never been made. Believe me, wherever there's trouble, Yemen, Syria, no matter where you have it, Iran is behind it. Today, I am announcing our strategy to ensure that Iran never, ever, and I mean never, acquires a nuclear weapon. If they restart their nuclear program, they will have bigger problems than they have ever had before. Big problems. I can tell you that. And we'll see what phase 2 is. Phase 2 might be positive and it might be very negative. But I will say, if Iran threatens us in any way, they will pay a price like few countries have ever paid.
Régis Le Sommier, the French news agency AFP, reporting that Trump will be walking away from that deal. The Reuters news agency in the past minutes saying there's going to be a three-way phone call that's to take place in a little over 1 hour's time between the French president, the German chancellor, and the UK prime minister. What does that tell you?
Well, I think everybody's trying to, come towards Trump and say, don't pull out of the agreement. I think Macron has been rather straightforward with the U.S. president saying that it's better to have a deal that's imperfect than no deal at all. So I think they're trying to do last minute push in order to make him change his mind. But I think there is only a very, very slim chance at this point. And what you've just the various segments you've pulled together indicates that Trump is not going to change his mind. He's never done that. I mean, he's maybe on North Korea he's changed his position because there was an evolution in the situation. But, look at the climate agreement. It was the same thing. He said he was going to pull out and he pulled out. So I'm actually, the timing and what he said looks exactly like, he said, tomorrow I will give my decision tomorrow. He said it was the exact same format for the climate change. And he put out a press conference and said he was pulling out of the deal. So I don't think there's any chance that he will change that. And and Macron and a lot of people are trying to tell him not to do it.
All right, lots of people going to Washington trying to convince him. The U.S. president, who looks steadfast, the last one to visit him was the UK foreign secretary, Boris Johnson, on Monday, echoing that pitch that was made at the end of last month by Macron and Angela Merkel.
The president has been right to call attention to it. But you've got to do that without just throwing the baby out with the bathwater, without scrapping the whole thing. Because if you do that, you have to answer the question, what next? What if the Iranians do rush for a nuclear weapon? Are we seriously saying that we're going to bomb those facilities at Coms and Fordow and Natanz? Is that really a realistic possibility?
Mr. Secretary,
or do we work with what we've got and push back on Iran together?
And Caroline Galacteros, you'll notice that Boris Johnson choosing the same medium as Emmanuel Macron when he was in Washington, Fox News, to get the U.S. president's attention. But a lost cause ahead of time if you listen to Régis Le Sommier going to Washington and doing that.
I think that the decision has been made by Donald Trump. So now,
so why do these leaders go to
what's next?
Washington? Why do they come to Washington to try to convince him? Is it
because they are part of the same deal? So they're supposed to be together in the same deal and to try to stay in all together. So they have perhaps to do that. But now the situation is very complicated because first you have this real threat from the U.S. to the Iranian. We heard that 3 minutes ago. Donald Trump threatened the Iranian government very directly, saying if you resume your nuclear program, you will have a big problem with us. So that's a very uncomfortable situation for Tehran. And for Europe, it's perhaps a big opportunity to stay together, UK, France, Germany, all the European countries are part of the deal, and to say, okay, we are in, we stay with Iran, perhaps we will fix or reinforce even the nuclear deal, but we cannot pull out and just follow the United States, which is probably part of what Donald Trump has in mind.
all right? An opportunity, say, for Europe. Hold that thought. We're going to pick up on it in a short while. But I want to get back to your first point, which is what they must be thinking over in Tehran. Reza Saya, we've seen that markets this Tuesday have been spooked with the price of oil in particular getting battered ahead of the announcement. What is the mood?
Well, I think Iranians are bracing for some bad news. There hasn't been any official reaction yet, but Iranians, like much of the world, they're hearing the early reports and the likelihood that Mr. Trump in less than an hour is going to pull out of the deal. So they're disappointed. And when you live in Tehran, you feel the mood. It's palpable. When Iranians are happy, when there's joy, you feel it. Also, when they're disappointed, when there's gloom in the air, it's palpable, you feel it, and today it's the latter. And remember, Iranians have been on a roller coaster of emotions ever since Iran and the world powers in 2015 started to negotiate the nuclear deal. You'll recall in 2015, after a lot of hard work, this agreement was signed, and there was a huge party in the streets of Tehran. There was joy, there was ecstasy. Many Iranians thought that this was the turning point. There was hope this would improve relations with the West, with the U.S. It would boost the economy with the nuclear deal, opening up Western markets to Iran. And in came President Trump last year in what had been a policy of engagement under the previous president, President Barack Obama, suddenly shifted to a policy of confrontation, repeated claims by Mr. Trump that he was going to tear up the deal. And now today, all indications are that he's going to pull the U.S. Out of the deal. And certainly, Iranians are disappointed. However, when you talk to them, they remind you that they've heard bad news before. They are a resilient people, and they say they'll get through it. Even though they're disappointed. They were hoping that this would turn things around for them, but obviously all indications are that there's going to be more conflict with the West, especially Washington.
All right, at this point, I want to bring in two more guests from Jerusalem, Aaron Lerman, Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategic Studies, former advisor to the Prime Minister's office. Thank you for being with us in the France 24 debate. I also want to thank Eric Lisan, legal analyst and former U.S. federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C. Eric, we're going to pick up on the question that was put by Caroline Galacteros, which is what next? It turns out, and we're going to talk through it now, there's more than one option. If Donald Trump decides to walk away, the U.S. will reimpose sanctions on Iran. 2 baskets of sanctions. The first one, which would be on the nation's oil as exports, and the other, thanks to sanctions on the Iranian central bank, and another set of sanctions on firms, and their waivers expire, by the way, in July. There's another possibility that the U.S. reimposes, 2 possibilities. The U.S. can reimpose all the sanctions at once, or just the central bank sanctions. A little bit complicated to explain, but break it down for us. Which is the most probable option at this point?
Right now, the main sanctions that I think we're all, from a public point of view, looking at are the oil sanctions. And these are the ones that are affecting the price of oil, and these are the ones that the president can really effectively, almost unilaterally exercise in his capacity as president of the United States. Congress has given him the authority to do that. Now, Congress could take it away, but it's very unlikely, given this Congress, that they would, even though this is not that much different from the Senate that approved the bill back in 2015. But once hearing that the president wants to do something, these Republicans have shown that they've been quiescent in almost his every wish. So we could be looking at, in all probability, a reimposition of oil sanctions, which would make it very difficult for Iranian oil to be exported around the world. But there's a time lag on all of these sanctions also, so it wouldn't necessarily be implemented tomorrow. It could take weeks or even months for it to be in a position where it would be executed, and we'd see the real effect on prices at the pumps. Aside from that, there's other sanctions, as you pointed out, so it does get very complicated. Some of these sanctions are strictly related to the nuclear deal. Some of these sanctions are related to other activities, even related to terrorism. The president, in his mind, tends to jumble them all up, and he's very unsatisfied because the nuclear deal was, by its terms and design, limited only to the nuclear question and allowed Iran to continue its ballistic rocket program and missiles, and to continue its interference in other volatile hotspots around the world. That's been one of his big problems with the whole deal. And the U.S. does, because of its economic size, have the ability, a lot of people don't realize this, but the U.S. can unilaterally impose a great deal of sanctions, which will cause a lot of problems. But they won't necessarily get the Europeans, and they certainly won't get the Russians and the Chinese to go along with it. So there's a lot of moving pieces here and a lot of volatility that can be introduced.
A lot of volatility. Aaron Lerman, I know that the Prime Minister of Israel is in favor of scrapping the deal. What's your preferred option?
Well, actually, the Prime Minister has been very clear in his famous speech in March 2015 and in more recent statements that he's not necessarily against a deal, but he's very much in favor of a new deal, a different deal. And the main question, the most dominant question as far as we are concerned, is what will happen in the middle of the next decade, roughly 2025, when the sunset clauses kick in. And we saw some progress, by the way, in the European position on this, in Macron's visit in Washington, and in his later coordination with Merkel and May. Apparently, this was not fast enough and not dramatic enough to satisfy the American administration. But clearly, from an Israeli point of view, the question is not regime change in Iran, although this would be very good for the Iranian people. It's not sanctions as such, but it is the need to fix, particularly the sunset clauses, that also to deal with the Iranian ballistic missile program and the question of regional subversion. The four pillars that Macron mentioned in his congressional speech are not very far from the Israeli position. If you read, for example,
but the Israeli position, because it's almost time for the break. Just very quickly, Régis Le Sommier. Of course, if the deal is completely scuttled at this point,
I see two major losers who are Emmanuel Macron, because he was going to be blamed for trying to cozy up to Donald Trump and getting nothing. It was the case, we've said, with the climate agreement. It was the case with the embassy, the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem, because the
moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem.
Yes, that was another one. And now comes the nuclear deal. Emmanuel Macron goes to put a lot on his
political capital.
Yes, on this, and get rebuffed if Trump withdraw. And the other big loser is going to be Hassan Rouhani, because there are a lot of hardliners in Iran who were against this agreement and who are going to be very happy because they say, okay, we're going to be able to develop our nuclear program. The thing we've seen, with a lot of opponent to the, and especially with Netanyahu showing
his big PowerPoint presentation last week.
The PowerPoint presentation actually worked for staying in the deal. Why? Because it didn't show that the Iranians had break anything beyond 2015. So that they stuck to the deal, and that was one major point that when we came out of this presentation. It was let's scrap the deal. That okay, but nothing shows that the Iranians have moved against the deal. So at this point, it's probably much better to stay in that deal instead of letting them loose and develop.
I know Aaron Lerman wants to jump in. We have to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. "28 minutes to go till the top of the hour in Washington. That's when Donald Trump will be announcing whether or not he's walking away from the Iran nuclear deal. Our panel, believes that will be the case. We're talking about it with Régis Le Sommier, Associate Editor-in-Chief at French news weekly magazine Paris Match. Political scientist Caroline Galacteros, CEO of Planeting, is also with us here in the studio. From Tehran, Reza Sayah, our correspondent. From Jerusalem, Aaron Lerman of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategic Studies. Eric Lisan, former U.S. federal prosecutor, is with us from Washington, D.C. And joining us now from Brussels is our correspondent there, Pierre Benazet. Pierre, in part one of our discussion, Caroline Galacteros saying that what could unfold could be an opportunity for Europe. Before I turn to you, let's listen to the reaction of Iran's president on Monday. He offered up the option and it sounded like a call to Europe when he said there is the option of Iran staying in the agreement without the United States.
What we want for the deal is that it's preserved and guaranteed by the non-Americans. And then the US pullout will be okay. We will get rid of a mischievous element that has always caused trouble. And if what we want is not fulfilled, we have our own legal and lawful path and have our own plans.
Pierre Benazet, as we listen to those words, bear in mind as well that while we're speaking, there's a three-way phone call going on between the French president, the German chancellor, and the UK prime minister.
And there's also been this afternoon in Brussels, well, at midday in Brussels, a meeting of these three countries, the E3 as they are called in this process, here at the European External Action Service, with their, so to say, Iranian counterparts, Abbas Araghchi, who was one of the chief negotiators, is the vice minister for foreign affairs of Iran, and he was in Geneva during the talks. He was there even before Jawad Zarif arrived for these negotiations. So he's the go-to man for the Europeans in Tehran, if you will. And these three countries, with the Iranians and with the European Commission, have reiterated their support for this process, their support for the JCPOA, the fact that they want to see this deal going on. You know that the European Union has said by the voice of High Representative Federica Mogherini that the deal was a go for them, that this deal was working, that it was delivering, and that it had to keep on going on, even without the United States, is the innuendo in all that.
The innuendo in all of that. Many thanks for that update, Pierre. Let me turn to our legal counsel on this one. Eric Lisson, we saw a few years back French bank BNP get battered for doing transactions that were not on U.S. soil, but because they used U.S. dollars, they got hit with a big fine. We know that today the French Public Investment Bank is trying to figure out a way to spur investments in Iran without using dollars, only in euros. Can it work?
Probably not. This is something that's been discussed for a long time, and it's very difficult to structure major global deals without touching U.S. dollars and without in some way implicating the jurisdictional powers of the United States. So it's theoretically possible. It would take a lot of coordination, but executing it would be very, very difficult. And this is one of the areas that does give the United States great leverage. And indeed, the biggest criticism, and maybe the most legitimate criticism of the deal that Obama negotiated, was that he didn't really take advantage of that leverage that the U.S. had, and he never really sought, or his people never really sought to consider the long-term effectiveness of sanctions if they were properly executed. I'm not sure that this administration understands it much better either, but it's in their interest to do so if they really want to scuttle the deal. So, as you point out, that BNP Paribas case is a good example of the reach, the long arm reach of U.S. jurisdiction, even in the unilateral imposition of sanctions. So this is one playing card that Trump has that perhaps has been understated.
Reza Saya, when you listen to what Eric Lisson just said, those words we heard at a few minutes ago from the Iranian president, where he said, "Hey, we can, if we can we'll stay in this agreement without the United States." Are those words empty?
Well, we'll have to wait and see, but I think you have to pay close attention to what President Rouhani says. And it is an indication of how they're going to react if indeed Mr. Trump pulls out. Keep in mind, there's a lot of bluster here from Iranian leaders, the supreme leader, hardliners, that they're going to hit back. Obviously, there's the perception, especially in the Western media, the U.S. media, Iran is portrayed as an aggressor in the region led by a radical government. But keep in mind, a radical government doesn't stay in power for 40 years. This government, this leadership has been in power for 40 years, and many objective observers say that is because that they're very practical, that they don't make drastic, impractical, illogical decisions. And many believe that if indeed Mr. Trump pulls out, they're going to remain practical and very cautious. And President Rouhani's words indicated that. If you look at what's happened in Syria, it's a perfect example of how Iran might react. Israel, over the past several months, has attacked Iranian bases, Iranian interests in Syria. And obviously many people anticipated that Iran would hit back. They did not. They pretty much kept silent. And again, that's an indication that the Iranian government, no matter how they're portrayed in the Western media, in the Eastern media, they're very cautious with their decisions. They don't want to make a decision to escalate tensions and perhaps set the stage for a military confrontation that, one, they don't want, and two, they don't have the military capabilities to address. So certainly, if Europe sticks with the deal, although they're not going to benefit much, Iran won't. With the U.S. Staying in the deal, it is certainly possible, and history shows with their decisions, it is possible that in some way, shape, or form, they'll keep the deal intact, although it's nothing like what they hoped when it was signed in 2015.
Caroline Galacteros, if you're advising, if you the CEO of French car maker Peugeot, for instance, or one of the French companies that's been trying to do deal or has done some deals timidly since the 2015 agreement, you listen to Eric Lisson say, look, at some point or one point or another, the U.S. will catch up with you if you do business with Iran.
Yeah, but that's up to us to decide in the end if we really want, to the end of the times, support and accept this extraterritoriality of U.S. law. So that's the big issue. In my opinion, that's the big issue behind all this case.
Are we seeing a new rift developing between the United States and Europe over this Iran deal? Is this going to further drive?
It can be, it could be, because it can be a real world shift of the world balance of power. Because if Europe sticks to the deal, if the Iranians are cautious, and I totally agree with your correspondent in Tehran, they are very cautious, they understood what America wanted to do, so probably they won't hit back because that's what Washington is probably expecting from them. So if you have Europe, Iranians sticking to the deal, and then Russia, and then China, and then it transforms all the balance of power.
You also have to bear in mind, speaking about Iran, that Hassan Rouhani, who was referring to earlier on, has been re-elected by a wide margin the last time, and he's a moderate. And that the people of Iran stick to the moderate side is also an indication that the Iran society is not an old war-looking country. It's not necessarily. We know, they have, the Revolutionary Corps, but they have elements. They have extreme elements in the Iranian society. But as a whole, they have given proofs in the past years that they're not the ones seeking wars at any cost. And this rationality of the Iranians is sometimes pushed aside by a narrative that's been pushed very recently. Because look back 2 years, it was ISIS was on the table. It was we had to gather.
But if you look at the 3 years,
and all of a sudden,
Régis, if you look at the 3 years since that deal was signed, Iran has extended its influence in the region. You've got the proxy battle taking place in Syria, the proxy battle taking place in Yemen.
Why did Iran extend its influence? Because of the collapse of the Arab states and their influence. I mean, like the first reason for the extension of Iran influence in the region is the United States intervention in Iraq in 2003. Exactly. They gave the power to a caste of people, of Shia people, who have been raised in Tehran. I mean, looking back in times, I mean, they shift the power completely in Iraq. I mean, the power was under a Sunni caste, and it became Shia. And in many fields, the extension of the Iranian influence is because of Western intervention and same thing with Syria. I mean, look.
I want to get back though to the issue that you were bringing up, Caroline, which is this wedge that's growing between the United States and Europe. And on that point, Aaron Lerman, do you see that wedge between the U.S. and Europe having negative implications for Israel? Is Israel going to have cooler relations with the European Union going forward and its members?
Well, quite frankly, the key European players do not accept the deal as it is. The language that was used, not enough to persuade Trump perhaps, but was quite convincing on the question of the need for a new agreement looking towards 2025. So the gap between the European and American positions seems to be more a matter of style than of substance. And that's also true in the case of Israel. Let's remember that it's not Israel alone. a very significant group of regional players feel very differently about Iran than what has been discussed here. That's not just us. The leadership of Saudi Arabia has been comparing Khamenei to Hitler and reminding us that Rouhani and Zarif, with all due respect, have very little to do with the making of Iranian policy. And therefore, I believe that European voices will once again be attentive to this after the dust settles. I would say that after 500,000 dead in Syria by a regime backed by the Iranian leadership, I think we should be very careful about describing Iran as a moderate force in the region. And I believe that there will be commonalities emerging, even if the style and the manner of Trump's decision-making is currently generating a sense of disagreement.
All right, just a couple of other points on this. Again, as we're now 15 minutes away from that decision from the White House, you can watch live here on France 24. First of all, there's a bit of a Twitter row developing. Last week, the Boston Globe reporting that Barack Obama's Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, met last month at the UN for the second time with his former Iranian counterpart, Mohammad Javad Zarif, and also spoke with the presidents of France and Germany in a bid to salvage the Iran deal. Kerry's stealth diplomacy, well, getting a review on Twitter from none other than the 45th president of the United States, Donald Trump, saying the United States does not need John Kerry's possibly illegal shadow diplomacy on the very badly negotiated Iran deal. He was the one that created this mess in capital letters in the first place. Eric Lisan, panelists on this show have often not been very kind to Donald Trump, but is he right on this one, that the former U.S. Secretary of State should just stay out of it?
He's right that that the former Secretary of State Kerry needs to be very careful, but of course this is hypocritical coming from the current president when they were as guilty about this as anybody in their dealings with the Russians, probably more so and more detrimentally so. But Secretary Kerry is free to speak publicly as any citizen can, but he cannot lobby in an undisclosed way for any sort of foreign power, and he cannot hold himself out as a official representative of the U.S. government without actually having the power to do so.
So how do you interpret what these two meetings?
I'm not really sure. Clearly he's not the some sort of emissary designated by the current administration. So it could be very problematic if he was doing anything more than expressing his views as a global citizen or as an expert on the deal. If he was trying to say that he would intervene somehow, there are very specific rules and laws that govern that, and he would have to be sure that he complied with them. I mean, this is the same kind of thing that Michael Flynn and this entire cast of characters that's criminally charged now has been guilty of. And so obviously the president has a point, if unintentionally ironic.
All right, and one other point on this. Britain's The Observer, Regis, last Sunday, reporting that operatives for Israeli private intelligence firm Black Cube, posing as journalists in a lot of cases, went to see some of those involved or influential in the 2015 nuclear agreement. A source with details of the, quote, dirty tricks campaign said the idea was that people acting for Trump would discredit those who were pivotal in selling a deal, making it easier to pull out. It's just... by the way, Black Cube denies this, by the way. But is this just standard ops for if you're trying to influence the planet, or is this a shocking revelation?
Well, not really, but when we know the extent to which the U.S. has been able to go in order to sail wars in the past, I mean, nothing is really surprising. There's obviously some PR working behind and trying to be influencers. But let's stay serious. What's really amazing when you think about Donald Trump is that on a number of topics, he's not taken seriously anymore. And on this one, all of a sudden, he became the wise guy because it serves some people's interest, and we've seen them, in many cases. And so Trump knows he has this power. Trump knows he's the leader of the number one power in the world. He has the biggest military in the world, and he wants to play that for one particular reason, because he wants to show his electorate that the U.S. is still, he's stuck to his campaign. You can't deny this. Make America great again. Make America scary again. That's what he's doing right now. And he knows how to play that and probably enjoys it a lot.
Reza Sayed, how do Iranians read Donald Trump? If we give an example on the other side of the globe, he was calling Kim Jong-un Rocket Man a short while ago. Now he's getting set to sit down with him. What's the feeling on that?
Yeah, I think in many ways, like much of the world, they're amused by him. They find him interesting. They find him unpredictable. But to many Iranians, he's no different than other U.S. presidents. Remember, when this deal was signed in 2015 under then U.S. President Barack Obama, it was Mr. Obama's unilateral sanctions that were still in place then that prevented a lot of European companies who were eager to do business with Iran to hold back, to be reluctant. So the U.S. Playing the role, putting up an obstacle in front of this deal didn't start when Mr. Trump took office. He certainly escalated it, but it started under Obama. And for many Iranians, it doesn't matter what U.S. president is in office, whether it's a Democrat or a republic. They've all engaged in policy to economically and politically isolate Iran. And for many Iranians, the order of this region, and for much of the world for that matter, is clear that if you follow the lead of the U.S., if you abide by the U.S., if you serve their interests, like Saudi Arabia does, other regional countries do, you're an ally, you're a friend, no matter what kind of activity you engage in the U.S. But if you defy U.S. Hegemony, if you defy U.S. Interests, like Iran has, they believe that the U.S. will take any measure necessary to isolate Iran, again, politically and economically. So Mr. Trump, his behavior, no different to many Iranians from many others.
And at the outset of the show, Caroline Galacteros was commenting on the not-so-veiled threat that Trump was making towards Iran if it did restart its a nuclear program. Now, if walking away from the deal doesn't put the U.S. on a direct collision course with Iran, the other question is, could it put Israel on a direct collision course with Hezbollah, the Iran-backed Lebanese militia, whose allies made big inroads in Sunday's first general election there in nearly a decade? Before there's a war with Iran, Aaron Lerman, should we be braced with another war between Israel and Hezbollah?
We always have to be on alert with people whose basic orientation is our destruction. However, Hezbollah today has three excellent reasons to avoid another round. First of all, they have learned some bitter lessons in 2006. The second point is that they are deeply now involved in Syria. Many of their fighters were killed there. I assume that they are wise enough to understand that fighting ragtag rebels in Syria did not prepare them for a war with the IDF, quite the opposite. And there are many Sunnis, many vengeful Sunnis in Lebanon and Syria today who would be glad to finish them off if they are deeply weakened by a conflict with Israel. And the third reason is that the Iranians are trying to keep Hezbollah safe against the day when and if there may be a confrontation between the United States or Israel and Iran over the nuclear question. And to use Hezbollah earlier and lose it in battle with Israel is not a very intelligent choice from an Iranian point of view.
All right, we're going to leave it there because unfortunately the clock is ticking. Just a word to Reza Sayeh in Tehran. Be on standby because President Rouhani is to announce his reaction to Trump's nuclear deal decision on television in a short while. We'll be crossing back over to you. Many thanks for joining us from Tehran. I want to thank Aaron Lerman in Jerusalem, Eric Lisan in Washington, Régis Le Sommier, Caroline Galacteros. Stay with us. Laure Cellier will be with you shortly to catch Donald Trump's announcement and plenty of reaction to come. You're watching France 24.